My cousin rolled her eyes and said, "Don't talk to him. He's the one who couldn't even afford a tie for the wedding." The whole table laughed while I sat there in my old suit. But then, the groom's father got up, walked over, and shook my hand. As he started talking about me, everyone felt humiliated because of what they did to me. I, 32M, was humiliated at my cousin's wedding for being poor. Then the groom's father revealed who I really was. I stood at the entrance of the banquet hall, tugging at the sleeves of my 5-year-old suit jacket. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, and the pants had been hemmed twice to hide the fraying. I knew I looked out of place among the sea of designer wear and glittering jewelry, but this was family. My cousin was getting married, and despite everything, I'd driven 6 hours to be here. The wedding was extravagant in a way that made my stomach turn. Ice sculptures shaped like swans, a champagne fountain, centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My aunt had always been obsessed with appearances, and she'd clearly spared no expense for her daughter's big day. I found my assigned table in the back corner, practically hidden behind a decorative column. The message was clear even before I sat down. My cousin, the bride, spotted me as I made my way through the crowd. She was radiant in her dress, though her smile faltered slightly when her eyes landed on me. She whispered something to her mother, and I watched my aunt's face twist into that familiar expression of disappointment she'd worn throughout my childhood. They both looked away quickly, as if acknowledging me might somehow taint the perfection of the day. I'd barely settled into my seat when the others at my table arrived. I recognized most of them, distant relatives I hadn't seen in years, the kind who only showed up for weddings and funerals. Among them was another cousin, the bride's sister, who'd always had a particular talent for cruelty disguised as honesty. She took one look at me, and her eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. She leaned over to the woman next to her, speaking just loud enough for everyone to hear, asking if I was really wearing that old thing. The woman glanced at me and covered her mouth, trying to hide her smirk. My cousin continued, saying I couldn't even afford a proper tie for the wedding. She rolled her eyes dramatically and told the others not to bother talking to me, that I was the one who'd shown up looking like I'd raided a thrift store bargain bin. The entire table erupted in laughter. Not polite chuckles or uncomfortable titters, but full-throated laughter that drew attention from nearby tables. I felt my face burning as I stared down at my plate, wishing I could disappear into the expensive flooring. Someone made a comment about how I should have at least tried to look presentable, and another voice chimed in asking if I'd come straight from a job interview at a fast food restaurant. The jokes kept coming, each one landing like a physical blow. I'd grown up poor. Not the romanticized kind of poverty that builds character in movies, but the real kind that means choosing between electricity and groceries, wearing shoes until they literally fell apart, and learning to be invisible because being noticed meant being reminded of what you didn't have. My father had died when I was 8, leaving my mother to raise 3 kids on a waitress's salary. My aunt, her sister, had married well and never let us forget it. Throughout my childhood, family gatherings had been exercises in humiliation. My cousins received new bikes and gaming consoles while I got hand-me-downs and off-brand toys from the dollar store. They took skiing vacations while we spent summers in our unair-conditioned apartment. My aunt would make comments about how my mother should have been smarter with money, should have found a better man, should have done 1,000 things differently. As if poverty was a choice, a moral failing rather than a circumstance. I'd escaped as soon as I could. Put myself through community college while working 3 jobs, lived in a car for 4 months during my junior year, graduated with a degree in computer science, and enough debt to crush most people. But I'd made it out. The last 5 years had been a blur of 80-hour work weeks, ramen noodles, and a studio apartment I shared with 2 roommates. I was building something, even if no one in my family could see it. The ceremony had been beautiful, I had to admit. The groom seemed like a decent guy, though I'd only met him once before at a brief family dinner. His family was clearly wealthy, the kind of old money that didn't need to announce itself. His father was a prominent businessman whose name I'd recognized from news articles, and his mother had that effortless elegance that came from generations of privilege. As the reception continued, I tried to make myself smaller, less noticeable. I picked at my food and avoided eye contact with anyone at my table. The speeches began, and I found myself only half listening as various relatives and friends stood to toast the happy couple. The groom's father eventually took the microphone, and I expected the usual platitudes about love and partnership. Instead, he started talking about character, about the difference between wealth and worth, between appearance and substance. He spoke about how easy it was to judge people by their clothes, their cars, their zip codes, and how rarely those surface markers revealed anything meaningful about who someone truly was. The room had gone quiet, and I noticed a few uncomfortable shifts in seats around me. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He pointed directly at me and asked me to stand up. Every eye in that banquet hall turned to look at me. My cousin who'd mocked me went pale. My aunt's mouth fell open. I stood on shaking legs, convinced I was about to be asked to leave, that somehow my presence had offended the groom's family, and I was about to be publicly ejected from yet another place where I didn't belong. The groom's father walked over to my table, his hand extended. He shook my hand firmly and asked me to join him at the front of the room. I couldn't have refused if I'd wanted to. My legs were moving on autopilot, carrying me through a crowd that parted like I was diseased. When we reached the microphone, he kept one hand on my shoulder and addressed the room. He told them he wanted to share a story. 3 years ago, his company had been on the verge of collapse. They'd been hit with a massive cyber attack that had crippled their systems and threatened to leak sensitive client information. They'd hired every top cybersecurity firm in the country, but no one could track down the breach or prevent the impending disaster. His company's reputation, built over 4 decades, was about to be destroyed in a matter of days. Then, he said, a young freelancer had reached out through their website's contact form. Someone with no fancy credentials, no big-name company backing him, just a community college degree and a message saying he'd seen news about the attack and thought he could help. His IT director had almost deleted the email, but something made him forward it up the chain. Out of desperation, they'd given this unknown kid a chance. I'd worked for 72 hours straight. I remembered that job clearly. It had been my first major contract, the one that had finally let me quit 2 of my 3 jobs. I tracked the breach to a sophisticated ransomware operation, isolated the infected systems, and not only prevented the data leak, but helped them rebuild their security infrastructure from the ground up. They'd paid me well, though not nearly what the big firms would have charged, and I'd used that money to pay off a chunk of my student loans. The groom's father continued, his voice carrying across the silent room. He said I'd saved his company. More than that, I'd refused to take advantage of their desperation. While other contractors had quoted prices in the hundreds of thousands, I'd charged a fair rate for the work done. When they'd offered me a bonus, I'd asked them to donate it to a scholarship fund for low-income computer science students instead. He'd been so impressed that he'd had his people look into my background, learned about my circumstances, about how I'd put myself through school. Over the next 3 years, he revealed, his company had hired me for multiple projects. I'd become one of their most trusted contractors, the person they called when something critical needed fixing. Last month, they'd offered me a full-time position with a salary that would put me firmly in the upper middle class. I'd accepted and was set to start after a brief vacation, this wedding being part of that vacation time. He turned to me then and asked if I'd kept quiet about all of this. I managed to nod. He smiled and told the room that I was exactly the kind of person his son should aspire to be, someone who'd built themselves up through actual merit rather than coasting on family money. He said he'd been thrilled when his son announced he was marrying into a family that produced people like me, but he was disappointed to see how that same family had treated me this evening. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked out at the tables and saw my aunt's face had gone from red to white. My cousin, the one who'd led the mockery, looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Other relatives who'd laughed at me were suddenly very interested in their plates. My mother, sitting with my siblings at a different table, had tears streaming down her face. The groom's father wasn't finished. He announced that his company was launching a new scholarship program, funded with a substantial endowment, specifically for students from low-income backgrounds pursuing degrees in technology. The program would be named after my late father, using the name I'd mentioned to him years ago during a late-night conversation about what motivated me. He said the first recipient would receive their award next month, and he hoped it would change someone's life the way determination and hard work had changed mine. Then he raised his glass and proposed a toast, not to the bride and groom, but to character, integrity, and the courage it took to keep showing up even when the people who should support you treated you like you were worthless. People drank to that toast, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. What had been a celebration now felt like a trial, with my entire extended family in the defendant's chair. The groom's father returned to his table, but not before shaking my hand again and quietly telling me he was glad I'd come, that I'd shown more class in my old suit than most people in the room would show in a lifetime of designer wear. I returned to my table, but no one there would meet my eyes. My cousin who'd mocked me had disappeared, probably to the bathroom to hide. Others made excuses and drifted away to different parts of the reception. I sat alone at the table for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. My mother found me there. She wrapped her arms around me and apologized through her tears, saying she was sorry for every time she hadn't been able to give me what my cousins had, for every humiliation I'd endured because we'd been poor. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, that she'd given me something more valuable than money. She'd taught me that dignity wasn't for sale, and that the only person's opinion of me that mattered was my own. The rest of the reception was awkward for everyone but me. I actually started to enjoy myself once the weight of expectation and shame had been lifted. Several of the groom's relatives came over to introduce themselves, genuinely interested in my work and my story. The groom himself sought me out to thank me for coming and to apologize for not realizing what his in-laws had been doing. He seemed like a good guy, and I hoped my cousin deserved him. My aunt approached me as the evening was winding down. She tried to apologize, but her words were hollow, more concerned with appearances than genuine remorse. She suggested we forget about the unpleasantness and move forward as family. I told her we could be civil at family functions, but we'd never been family in any way that mattered. Family didn't keep score of who had more money or nicer things. Family didn't mock each other for circumstances beyond their control. She'd made it clear over 3 decades that my mother, my siblings, and I were lesser than in her eyes, and one speech wasn't going to erase that history. She tried to argue, bringing up blood relations and family loyalty. I pointed out that she'd shown no loyalty to her sister when she'd struggled, no compassion for children who'd lost their father. She'd used her wealth as a weapon to make herself feel superior, and now she was upset because someone wealthier had used that same weapon against her. The irony seemed lost on her, but I didn't care anymore. I was done seeking approval from people who'd never thought I was worth their time. Update 1. The wedding was 3 weeks ago, and the fallout has been more dramatic than I expected. My phone started blowing up the next day with messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Suddenly, everyone wanted to reconnect, to explain how they'd always believed in me, how proud they were of my success. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. My cousin, the bride, sent a long message apologizing for how I'd been treated. She claimed she hadn't known what her sister and the others were saying, that she'd been so focused on her wedding day she hadn't noticed. I didn't respond. Whether she'd actively participated or just passively allowed it to happen didn't really matter. She'd seated me at the reject table in the back corner. That told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in her hierarchy. Her sister, the one who'd led the mockery, posted a vague message on social media about judging books by their covers and how we all need to do better. She didn't tag me or mention the incident specifically, but several mutual connections put the pieces together. The comments section became a battlefield, with some people praising her self-awareness and others calling out her performative accountability. I stayed out of it entirely. The most surprising development came from the groom's father. He reached out to ask if I'd be interested in speaking at a conference his company was hosting about overcoming adversity in the tech industry. He wanted me to share my story, to inspire other people from non-traditional backgrounds who were trying to break into the field. I agreed, though the idea of public speaking terrified me. It felt important, like maybe something good could come from all those years of struggle. My mother has been different since the wedding. Lighter somehow. She told me she'd spent 30 years feeling like a failure because she couldn't provide for her kids the way her sister could, like poverty was a reflection of her worth as a person. Seeing me defended so publicly, having someone with actual power validate what I'd accomplished, had freed her from that shame. She'd stopped answering my aunt's calls, had stopped attending family events where she knew she'd be made to feel small. At 62, she was finally setting boundaries. I started my new job 2 weeks ago, and it's everything I'd hoped it would be. Good salary, interesting work, colleagues who respect my abilities rather than judging my background. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment, living alone for the first time in my adult life. It's not fancy, but it's mine, and that means everything. The scholarship program is moving forward. The first award will be announced next month, providing full tuition plus a living stipend for a student from a low-income background. The selection committee asked me to participate in reviewing applications to help identify candidates who showed the kind of determination and potential that transcended their circumstances. Reading through those applications, seeing my own story reflected back at me dozens of times over, was both heartbreaking and hopeful. My aunt made one more attempt at reconciliation, showing up at my mother's house unannounced. She brought up family history, talked about how their parents would have wanted us to stay close, tried every manipulation tactic in her arsenal. My mother finally stood up for herself, told her sister exactly what she thought of 30 years of condescension and cruelty dressed up as concern. She said that blood didn't entitle someone to treat you poorly, that family was something you built through actions rather than inherited through DNA. My aunt left in tears, and I've never been prouder of my mother. I won't pretend everything is perfect now. I still catch myself checking price tags obsessively, still feel a spike of anxiety when unexpected expenses come up, still sometimes can't believe this is my life now. Poverty leaves scars that money can't completely heal, but I'm learning to let go of the shame that was never mine to carry in the first place. The groom reached out last week to invite me to dinner with him and my cousin. He wants to build a genuine relationship, separate from all the family drama. I'm considering it. He seems like a good person who genuinely cares about my cousin, and maybe she's capable of growth I haven't seen yet. Or maybe I'm just finally secure enough in my own worth that I don't need to hold grudges against people who can't hurt me anymore. What happened at that wedding wasn't really about revenge, even though it might have looked that way. I didn't orchestrate any of it. I just showed up and existed, and sometimes that's enough. The truth is its own revenge against people who've built their identities on lies about superiority and worth. I didn't need to expose them. They exposed themselves the moment someone with more power than they had decided to tell the truth. I'm not the person I was when I walked into that banquet hall 3 weeks ago. I'm not carrying their judgment anymore, not letting their narrow view of success define my worth. I showed up in an old suit because it was what I had, and there's no shame in that. The only thing I'm ashamed of is how long I let their opinions matter, how many years I spent trying to prove myself to people whose approval was never worth having. The best revenge isn't public humiliation or dramatic reveals. It's building a life so full and genuine that their small-minded cruelty becomes irrelevant. It's being the kind of person who helps others climb the same ladder you struggled up, who uses whatever power they gain to lift people up rather than push them down. It's refusing to become what hurt you, even when you finally have the means to do so. I'm still learning what it means to be free of other people's expectations, but I'm getting there. One day, one choice, one moment of refusing to shrink myself at a time.